I don't necessarily have to agree with you, but I could include you anyway. That's okay. It's okay to accept people who don't think the same way you do. That's part of the grand diversity of us as a global society. That's it's that division of thought that ultimately is the spark of innovation.
Welcome to 3D View, one conversation, three different perspectives. I'm Lamondre Pugh.
I am David Perez.
And I'm Richard Strides. Thank you for joining us.
It's been a little while since you heard from us, since you've seen us, but we're back and we've got some new features attached to the show that we really think that you're going to enjoy. So we're going to jump right into this conversation. And today, what we're talking about is inclusion, what it means and why it matters. Gentlemen, let's talk about what inclusion is. So what does inclusion mean?
Well, I think inclusion can be looked at a couple different ways. Inclusion, certainly from an accessibility standpoint, means being inclusive of individuals and being able to accommodate individuals who may have varying abilities from one another. Inclusion can also mean certainly acceptance of a person's lifestyle, for example, and being inclusive of and being tolerant of an individual's religion, for example. So inclusive is an interesting word because it can mean so many different things in depending on the context that's being used. And oftentimes people can, when they hear the word inclusion, I think generationally, they'll think of a slightly different thing. So for example, an older generation, when they hear the word inclusion, will immediately think ADA and accessibility and disability and and all the elements around that. I think a younger individual, when you hear the word inclusion, they will think of it more as an acceptance of people as they are, depending on what pronoun they identify with, what religion they're with. It's a much broader sort of idea of inclusion. So I think it's interesting how that's just something that I've noticed in conversations that I've had with different individuals. So it's an interesting term.
Yeah, it absolutely is.
It is an interesting term because it's complex
Mm.
in and of itself, and people don't actually always understand what inclusion is when they're talking about it. And it's something that's talked about often in governments, in companies, and almost everywhere. And usually when you ask someone to define inclusion, they always go to being inclusive, which says everything and it doesn't say anything at the same time.
Right.
That's so true.
I think that inclusion in its essence comes from the human need to belong and being able to call the whole world, or as many people as possible, if not everyone, us, basically, that we are all the same thing. That's inclusion. And it's complicated because it has different levels and there are different things that inclusion touches, like being included in a game in school, being included in examples in your classroom, being included when you're applying for a job, being included when the economic system is not favoring you. So all of those things are part of what inclusion actually means, but it definitely means being able to call everyone part of us.
I think the perspectives are so interesting because you can ask a number of different people what inclusion is, and you may get a different definition from each of those people. And I think you're right, Richard. I've noticed too, if you speak to the more seasoned generations, they pretty much stick to the whole disability inclusion piece of it. But as you speak to the younger generation, you do hear a more broader perspective of what inclusion is. And I want to give you the definition from the from the Oxford languages. And what it says is inclusion is the practice or policy of providing equal access to opportunities and resources for people who might otherwise be excluded or marginalized, such as those with physical or mental disabilities or members of other minority groups. So this definition really leans on those who have traditionally been excluded, particularly those who've been pushed to the margins. And I think that with that kind of a definition and what both you and David said, I think it's important that we begin to talk about why that's so important. Why is being inclusive and why having an inclusion mindset is so important.
I think two things. I think it is encouraging that the younger generation looks at this term and embraces it in a much broader sense, because I think that's really important and puts a bright light on the future of us as a species. So that's a good thing. But more poignant to your question directly, I think the idea of being universal can only help in how we change and adopt how we live, how we work, how we construct policies. When the general and the broader mindset is that of a more inclusive state, a state of mind, I think we end up with a much better, wholer, and more inclusive society in general, regardless of where it is in the world. And again, I think it's positive in toward future that a lot of the issues, border issues and philosophical issues that exist between countries, and even the divisiveness internally in our here in the US that exists, these are really issues that are stemmed in the old way of thinking that I think in this day and age we're seeing doesn't even have a place anymore, which is why we have such a large divisiveness at this period of time. And because of that lack of understanding of a basic inclusion of all people and all ideas and all mindsets, the idea that if I'm right, you have to be wrong, because there is no possible any other way of thinking or correct way of thinking. And so that is by default is not being inclusive, right? In being acceptance of that other thought or ideology or what have you. So anyway, that's one approach or my concept of that.
Yeah. I also think that inclusion matters, or it's important, because it's morally.
It's the
If
right.
you're leaving someone out, you're wrong. There's no way around it. I do think that there's a clear line dividing what's right and what's wrong, and excluding people just because they don't form part of your group or the thing that you decided that was going to be your group, it's wrong, because you're leaving people, actual people, out of whatever it is. And when inclusion comes, and it comes as real inclusion, as a thing that's actually there, you can see the benefits immediately. Like Richard was saying, in better ideas, more diverse, addressing problems. It's really incredible what can happen when inclusion actually happens. But inclusion is usually not there. And that's, I think, the point of why it mattered most. What we need to talk about it is because it's usually not there. Usually people are being left behind, are being left outside of economic progress, of social progress, of public policy creation. So that's when inclusion needs to be most important, when there's something to fight for. And that's when people are being left out.
I agree. I think inclusion really matters because as the world has evolved and as we're becoming a much more global community, the gaps between the haves and the have-nots really demonstrate the need to be more inclusive. And what do I mean by that? As you pointed out, David, and you also, Richard, that when people are included, ideas begin to flourish. When people are included, solutions are birthed that otherwise would not have been even considered because that perspective was not represented. And what we've learned, particularly in the past 5 years globally, is that change happens swiftly. And that oftentimes the things that we're faced with are things that we haven't seen before as a mass group of people. So that inclusion, that input is essential for solving our problems quickly and for recognizing where issues arise quickly and also realizing that if an issue is affecting this group over here, then the whole is being affected. It's almost like this move towards sustainability. When we talk about sustainability, it is more than just about environment. It is more than just about the climate change. It is really about looking at how systems interrelate. And those systems will be social systems, economic systems, and in certain environmental systems as well. And the only way to really create sustainability is to have true inclusion. So, in order for us to not burn up our resources, in order for us to move forward as a society, in order for us to really have the economic systems that is beneficial for all of humanity, inclusion is the only way to make that happen. So that's my perspective as to why inclusion matters. But then that also leads to the next question. So if inclusion matters, what does being inclusive look like? What does that mean?
That's very complex. It depends on who you are, where you are, and what you're doing. Inclusion, as we have explored in in the last couple of minutes, is it's such a rich thing that it's almost impossible to just point at it and say that's what it looks like. But I think that inclusion is a decision to think beyond your group or your cultural demographic or whatever you're thinking, and realizing that to achieve true empowerment and progress on society, you actually need to make sure that everyone has a voice. And that's where it starts. You need to think about inclusion in business as making sure that people that don't usually get a chance do get a chance, and that you value everyone for their effort and what they're bringing to the table, instead of valuing them just because of other things that we know that happens. And you need to think about inclusion in government and policies as sometimes affirmative action. Sometimes that's part of inclusion, and that's what it looks like. I can't say that here's a nice book that you can read and learn all you need to know about inclusion, because that's not how it works. Inclusion is very dependent on where you are, who you are, what you're doing, and everything. Because inclusion has different faces, but the general idea is look beyond yourself, look beyond your group, and see what you can do for others.
I love what you said about inclusion being a choice, a decision, that inclusion is a decision. Yeah. Richard.
Yeah, what I was going to say is that, it starts with the self. However, global inclusion ultimately really is, and David, exactly to your point about how it can affect so many different areas of life and living in general. But ultimately, Lavonder, it's a choice, and it's a choice that we all individually make, whether consciously or subconsciously, to do it, to be inclusive. If everyone is inclusive in their mind and thought, then everything else doesn't start becoming an issue, because by default, everyone is just more inclusive. So I think starting with oneself, it sounds easy and it's extremely hard to do, of course, because everyone will have to go through the litmus test of how tolerant are you as a person of things that you aren't necessarily in agreement with, and how does that alter your behavior. So I don't necessarily have to agree with you, but I could include you anyway. That's okay. It's okay to accept people who don't think the same way you do. That's part of the grand diversity of us as a global society. It's that division of thought that ultimately is the spark of innovation, and it's the mother of invention. It's interesting how ultimately it starts with that personal choice of deciding to be inclusive, and for all the items, for all the areas that we spoke to, what that really means, from being inclusive and accepting a different flavor of ice cream, for example, than the one that you typically use, or individuals that you speak to, circles of people, circles of friends that maybe could broaden your idea or concept of something that maybe you hadn't even thought of before. And it again, I think the idea of choice, of personal choice, and deciding to consciously be more inclusive oneself, can drive a lot of this at a much larger and global scale.
Yeah, I want to add something to that,
Mm-hmm.
because even though it is a choice, again, it's morally wrong not to be inclusive. So it's an imperative. That's a choice you have, but you need to make the right choice. And the right choice is to be inclusive. Just in case people were thinking that they could choose not to be inclusive, that's wrong. I just wanted to be very clear about that.
Exactly.
And honestly, that is a battle that consistently rages. And when we see that played out particularly in politics, particularly in the way that the last few years, we saw a shift that happened that was really an anomaly, that it became about me. Everything became about me. If it's not for my country, if it's not about my country, the world be damned. And that was the exact opposite of that. And I think sometimes that the pandemic kind of shook us a bit, where we had to start thinking about others. We had to start thinking about, wait a minute, we are really all in this together. And how do we work that? And even that, we saw divisions that really were not pushing inclusive, but we had to. In order to survive, we had to become a more inclusive world in order to survive. Now, to me, inclusion looks like openness, that it's open to ideas, it's open to different perspectives, it's open to hearing and seeing and experiencing things that may not have been at the norm, or things that that are not in the center but on the margins, and honoring that, respecting that, and appreciating that. So it's more of a philosophical approach to what inclusion is, but that's how I see it, that inclusion equates to openness, and openness that fosters belonging, openness that says that I do belong, that I am here, or you belong. And even if we don't agree, that does not diminish the fact that you belong. So to me, inclusion is openness that leads to belonging. And so, of course, with that, the next question becomes then, how do we make inclusion happen? How do we do this?
Yeah, it's the thing, right? How to make it happen? Because even though the three of us work in inclusion and we know about inclusion, I'm sure that we often have that feeling of what these group of people is or are saying is simply not important because they're not in the same mindset as we are. So are we not being inclusive when we're doing that? Are we excluding people just because we think that they think different, even if they're not thinking precisely about their political affiliation, just thinking about when we think people are wrong? Are we being exclusive because in the way we act, in the way we take what they're saying? Because listening to to everything you guys just said and everything I've said, I'm realizing that, yeah, I've probably been exclusive of some people in some conversations and some things because they simply don't align with my viewpoint. And I think it's how to make inclusion happen as much as how it looks like has to do with the choice to do it,
Mhm.
to making the decision of actually going out there and looking at things critically and opening your mind to see where people are coming from. Because think about every individual, every human being as as a thing that's only looking through glasses, right? And those glasses comprise everything they see as reality. That can be whatever you think about: colors, political ideals, genders, anything. They only see what's inside that glass. So if you dismiss what they're saying or what they are thinking just because you don't understand where they are coming from, then there's no opportunity for progress. You are being exclusive. Even if your aim, your end goal is inclusion, you need to start by, and I know people use this word a lot, it's being tolerant. And after being tolerant, then understand where they're coming from and try to help them understand where you are coming from. And maybe that way we can make inclusion happen in all aspects of society. When people have conversations that actually mean something instead of having arguments. I think
Right.
that's where we can start.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that's an important part. That's an important point you bring up about having conversations and not just diametrically opposing, because it's a viewpoint that I don't necessarily agree with or don't necessarily understand. And oftentimes, not agreeing with something has to do with not understanding or lack of, a lack of understanding of somebody else's point of view. So I agree 100% that understanding where another individual is coming from is so critical in being accepting, and again, that word tolerant, of another individual, regardless of their opinion, because their opinion doesn't define whether or not they should be included or not. I think if we get caught in the trap of that, the social trap of that, and I think what we've seen play out in the past couple of years is the social trap that many individuals have fallen into, of listening to the constant do loop of only things that they agree with. And the negative side effects of that is that you end up with an incredibly divisive, polarized viewpoints on items, because everything has become so hybrid in and of itself, that the lack of diversity and inclusiveness of that other side, the sort of thinking or that other thought, ends up being so highly concentrated that, and you end up with this highly polarized viewpoints, and that is purely a sign of lack of inclusion, a lack of inclusiveness of not only just people's but thoughts and everything. And so I think we've seen displayed for us all to see as a giant lab in front of us what's happened when that lack of inclusiveness plays out to its umpth degree.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so interesting. I remember a few years ago, I was at a lot of years ago, actually, I was at a really large conference, and it was a conference of people with disabilities. And this group was extremely anti-institutionalization. And so am I, just for the record. So am I. But I remember there was a speaker that got it, because it was like an open mic where you could voice your opinion and ask a question. And one lady got up and she began to speak. And she simply said, there are instances where nursing home placement is appropriate. And before she finished the word appropriate, she was booed to the point where it was almost violent, where it was a situation where she literally left the ballroom in, in fear. And I remember sitting at the back of that ballroom thinking, this is scary. This is scary, because she didn't even get the opportunity to complete her statement. Now, don't get me wrong. She definitely did a terrible job at reading the room. Okay. She definitely,
Know your audience, right?
she did not know her audience, and I get that. But the vitriol and the things that were said to her, and that was literally all she got out in that statement. And it was that point that I realized, wow. I mean, to disagree with someone is one thing, but then to completely shut down their voice and not allow them to even express it. This is an instance where intolerance was really being demonstrated on the side of the people who thought that they were morally on the high ground, that they were morally in the right. And I think that what that says to me, and this goes to your point, David, that inclusion really starts with holding yourself accountable. If we really want to see inclusion in the forefront, then we must hold ourselves personally accountable and check ourselves, check our own biases, check our own levels of intolerance, and find out, wait a minute, is it just that I disagree? Or is it just that I'm not even seeing that there is a difference, or I'm not even recognizing that this difference even deserves the recognition of being there. And even though that may sound as obvious, yes, of course, it's not, because it manifests itself in some sneaky ways. And this is the one thing, and this is the one thing that I realized about inclusion. Even though we could say inclusion is simply providing equal access and opportunities to marginalized and otherwise disenfranchised populations, that sounds very simple, but it is also extremely complex and extremely nuanced. And it takes deep analysis in terms of who we are and how we contribute to systems that exclude others as well. What is our part in this? And I'm talking about in all of our systems. I'm not just talking about systems in which there is a dominant group that has power. but I'm talking about in our own systems that we create, in our own homes, in our own businesses, in our own environments. Are we being inclusive? Because I believe that is the only way to get to it, is those small things that we do that are then amplified, that pay into the larger system or contribute to the larger system. And this is how I believe that we can really begin to see inclusion happen in real and very unexpected ways. And so as we continue this conversation about inclusion, we want to hear from you. So drop us a line, join our Facebook group, drop us a message in our Facebook group. And we want to hear from you of why inclusion matters and what does that look like for you. And until the next time, thank you so much for joining 3D View.
Thanks for joining us this week on 3D View. Make sure to visit our website, ruglobal.com/3dview. That's ruhglobal.com/3dvu, where you can subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts or join our YouTube channel so you will never miss a show. While you're at it, if you find value in the show, we appreciate it if you would leave a like or comment or simply tell a friend about the show. That would really help us a lot too. If you would like to join our conversations, you can join our Facebook community, 3D View, 3 Perspectives, 1 Conversation.